Hi there, and welcome to Crash Course. My name's Brody Lawner. Today, we're going to be talking about the period in American history known as the Progressive Era.
Did someone say bundle your car's home and auto with progressive?
The Progressive Era was an immediate reaction from the Gilded Age, where wealth inequality soared, even though the majority of the population was impoverished. This era saw mountains of reform, whether that was for fair working conditions or gender equality. Things also suffered in the Progressive Era, like the fashion industry. I mean, look at this. Do you see this? What is she wearing? This was casual dress. I swear to God, how can they do this to women?
So, to kick us off, we're going to begin the social classes of the Progressive Era. At the top of the pyramid, we got the elites, the top dogs, the upper crust. These are the guys like John Rockefeller, who known as robber barons, and who created huge corporate businesses and monopolies, and then became philanthropists and funded famous schools and libraries and buildings and more. They lived lavishly in big mansions outside the city and were entirely in their own world, almost as if they were clueless about the people who were working so hard to keep them rich. Then there were the middle class that typically lived comfortably enough. They had better pay and better hours than the lower class and were treated like actual human beings. Next is the working class, which unlike the middle class, their work pretty much remained physical labor, working in sweatshops, factories, and unsanitary work conditions. These workers mainly consisted of European immigrants like Italians, Poles, Russians. They came to America for various reasons: to find a place to practice their religion freely, and to escape poverty and famine, which is pretty ironic because that's kind of what they met at the gates of America. Immigrants were also isolated from the rest of Americans, so they were often like outsiders with their own culture and beliefs. Settlement houses created to help and Americanize these immigrants. Some settlement house workers volunteered to move in with these immigrants in their apartments to teach them skills and improve their living conditions. Adults were taught to speak English and were given civics and history classes. Meanwhile, children were sent to school and were also taught English, American history, American culture, and more. This helped immigrants improve their living conditions and immerse themselves into American culture. Meanwhile, African Americans were fighting to create reforms to rise from all the restrictions that were keeping them from living equally to others. So, to kill two birds with one stone, the Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington, was an important part of education for Black people, as it allowed safe space for African Americans to obtain a higher education and self-sufficiency during segregation. Additionally, the NAACP, the oldest civil rights organization, was formed by Webb Du Bois and Ida U. Wells. They fought for Black rights by launching major anti-lynching campaigns and challenging segregation and more.
Industrial workers had a crazy bad schedule. They typically labored 6 days a week, 10 hours per day. Many factories worked in a division of labor system where production was split up into different parts, and each person would be assigned to a task. In addition to being boring and long, work was often dangerous. It was so bad that a priest once described a steel plant as the slaughterhouse. They killed them, the workers, there. In these factories, there was whirling shafts, slippery floors, spinning blades, molten steel. All of these could have hurt or killed someone. And they did. Also in these factories, no one cared about the workers. So that meant no helmets, no safety glasses, no guardrails, and no workers' comp. If you were one of the many people who got injured on the job, too bad. There was no obligated financial compensation, just as if these factories couldn't get any worse. Most sweatshops were extremely cramped and unventilated. Workers in textile mills had to inhale cotton dust all day. Cotton miners would breathe in coal dust, which would also grind itself into the skin, never to be removed. From this inhalation, a lot of textile workers and miners were in constant threat of contagious diseases like tuberculosis, which was the third leading cause of death at the time. If that was me, I'd protest, they all chant in union. Well, they couldn't. Because of the influx of immigrants looking for jobs, employers would just fire and replace them if they protested or opposed. But at least that was just work and they'd get to return to a nice, warm home. Wrong. Most workers lived in slums. A social reformer once described them as: streets are inexpressibly dirty, the number of schools inadequate, and the sanitary legislation unenforced, the street lighting bad, and the paving miserable. Ugh. In these slums, most lived in tenements, which are crappy little apartments about 6 floors tall that held 4 families each floor. There are usually only about 2 rooms, so that would mean the families would cook, eat, clean, and sleep all in the same room. And because of how cramped and dirty and airless these buildings were, disease flourished here too.
One man was on a mission to expose these working conditions in a way that would change public opinion forever. His name was Upton Sinclair, a muckraker that set his sights on the food packaging industry. Muckrakers are investigative reporters that attempt to expose corruptions and injustices in society. Hey, would you look at that? It's time for the mystery document. Now, before I open this, I'm going to guess that this is an excerpt from Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle.
They were beaten. They had lost the game. They were swept aside. It was not less tragic because it was sordid, because it had to do with wages and grocery bills and rents. They had dreamed of freedom, of a chance to look about them and learn something, to be decent and clean, to see their child grow up to be strong. And now it was all gone. And it would never be. They had played the game and they had lost. 6 more years of toil they had to face before they could expect the least respite, the cessation of the payments upon the house, of cruelty and certainty. It was that they could never stand 6 years of such a life as they were living. They were lost, they were going down, and there was no deliverance for them, no hope. for all the help it gave them in the vast city in which they lived might have been an ocean waste, a wilderness, a desert, a tomb.
The Pure Food and Drug Act was actually part of a larger series of progressive reforms from one of several progressive presidents we'll be discussing today. I'm talking, of course, about every 7-year-old boy's favorite president, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt became the youngest person to ever hold office after William McKinley got shot by an anarchist in Buffalo, New York. The assassination quickly became the third worst thing about Buffalo, right behind number 2, their sports teams, and number 1, the city of Buffalo. McKinley introduced the gold standard, wherein gold became the basis for U.S. currency, and yeah, that pretty much covers McKinley. On to Roosevelt! Teddy ran on the Square Deal, which was rooted in the 3 C's: conservation, consumer protection, and of course, control of corporations, which is what the Pure Food and Drug Act fell under. For conservation, Roosevelt, ever the Boy Scout, created the first national parks, as well as the U.S. Forest Service and the first real legislation saying that we couldn't just log until all the trees were gone. Good thing we're back to drill, baby, drill. That takes us to consumer protection, where Roosevelt began better regulating food and medicines by requiring proper labeling, empowering the FDA and Department of Agriculture to inspect products, and probably putting your local snake oil salesman out of business. On the control of corporations front, Roosevelt took the Sherman Antitrust Act and used it to bust up a whole bunch of trusts, taking down monopolies including John D. Rockefeller's infamous Standard Oil Company.
Now, when talking about Standard Oil, one has to mention that this Goliath of industry has a David. Her name was Ida Tarbell. She was another muckraker determined to expose the cruelties of Standard Oil and the atrocities that J.D. Rockefeller was committing. She gives perfect examples of this in her book, The History of Standard Oil, where she explains how people in control were using their influence to step over the little guy. In her example, she uses her father, who was an independent oil producer, to move forward in their gains. Does that remind you of anything that we see in modern day? Remember, kids, history is a cycle.
As a result of Ida Tarbell's work exposing Standard Oil, the federal government sued Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the monopoly was forced to break into 34 smaller companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron.
Theodore Roosevelt's successor, William Taft, of bathtub fame, continued this tradition of cracking down on monopolies. He actively prosecuted companies that had too much power and tried to promote competition, which history has taught us results in more innovation, lower prices, and better products. Taft also lowered tariffs on imported goods, making it easier for consumers to access products and small businesses to compete. Perhaps his greatest addition to our nation, though, is the bane of all conservatives, the 16th Amendment, which basically founded the modern federal income tax system, much to the chagrin of robber barons and corporations. William Taft might not have been progressive enough for Roosevelt, but he sure sounds like someone we could use today.
Speaking of progressive, another muckraker that was very prominent at this time period was Ida B. Wells. I know, we're going 2 for 2 on Idas. She's very famous for her book, Southern Horrors, where inside the book, she talks about violent crimes happening in the southern United States, and this includes a very serious topic of lynching of African Americans. This book would then become the influence of the creation of one of my personal favorite songs, Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday, which caused 2 big anti-lynching subjects to be brought to the attention of the media.
African Americans struggled greatly during the Progressive Era, but they weren't giving up on making changes and fighting for their rights to live their best lives. To avoid racism and harsh segregation wherever they went, many Black people lived in all Black communities, but for those who didn't, it was an everyday struggle to live amongst white people. Even though they were now free, Black people had very little resources and were denied any job that paid a lot or required any skills. Most were sharecroppers or had jobs that paid extremely low wages, such as farming, factory workers, and transportation. Many couldn't read or write and were denied access to an education. Additionally, African Americans had finally gained suffrage, but this was very limited due to poll taxes, literacy tests, and property qualifications, all of which required resources that Black people had limited access to. All the while, Black people all over were fighting for civil rights and social justice. Webb Du Bois introduced the concept of the talented 10th, meaning that the top 10% of educated African Americans should lead the fight for civil rights. As previously mentioned, activists like Ida B. Wells was an investigative reporter who spoke out against the lynching of African Americans. Booker T. Washington focused on practical skills to achieve economic independence as a pathway to civil rights, and he believed in gradual progress through education and hard work.
Organized labor unions fought for better wages, reasonable hours, and safer working conditions. However, the industry's employers and the government super resisted this, so the workers decided to strike. Just to list a few. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Flint Sit-Down Strike of 1936 exposed terrible conditions the factory workers endured and the resistance of factory owners to fix anything. Plus, government and police forces often sided with industries, not the workers. While most strikes at the time were unsuccessful, the wants of the American laborers were being shown. Unrelated, how old are you? 16? Why aren't you in the mines? That's how I imagine it would have been like in the Progressive Era. During this time, child labor was a big and normal thing. Because of the terrible and unlivable wages, anyone who could work in the family would. Also, children earned less than adults, so factory owners were more than happy to exploit even cheaper labor. Now obviously, people didn't like this, so some states made a law setting a minimum age to work, which was usually 14 or 15. but literally no one cared. No states enforced it, and so no companies followed it, which meant we had 6-year-olds in cotton mills and 8-year-olds in the mines. Even worse, because children were so small back then, they could fit into parts of running machinery and drive mules through small mining tunnels, which were prone to collapsing. A Pennsylvania newspaper wrote, "During the past week, nearly 1 boy a day has been killed in the mines."
Anyways, on a bit of a brighter note, women's rights. Women have publicly demanded the right to vote since 1848, when a group of 300 men and women convened to discuss women's rights, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton declared that basically, we need to be able to vote. Progress was slow from there, but suffragists organized into the NAWSA, or National American Women's Suffrage Association, turning the movement into a serious political machine. The American West led charge to giving women voting rights state by state. 4 states by 1898 and up to 15 by 1918.
The most impactful reforms that aided these underrepresented groups, however, were the Progressive Amendments. First, the 17th Amendment would allow the direct election of senators, taking power from state legislatures and putting it back in the hands of the people, thus giving people better and more direct representation in their government. The 18th would establish prohibition, which may not seem very progressive by today's standards, but was implemented with the goal of ending the rampant problems involved with alcohol abuse, including things like domestic violence, rape, and child abuse. So although the 18th Amendment ultimately failed, it did try, with some very limited success, to curb problems faced by vulnerable groups like women and children. Finally, 105 years ago, which seems way too recent, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. This meant that finally women could have the power to express their beliefs at the ballot box and represent their own interests in our government. Both of these amendments came under the presidency of one Woodrow Wilson, a somewhat neurotic man who saw himself as a bit of a Jesus figure in the world story. Wilson was the last of the progressive presidents, and despite any other issue he may take with his time in office, he did a good job wrapping up the progressive era in a metaphorical bow, strengthening previous policies and adding his own that lasts up until today. Under his policy of New Freedom, which is also the title of his book on the topic, Wilson continued the work of previous presidents, promoting competition, lowering tariffs, and passing bills that strengthened antitrust laws. This includes the Clayton Antitrust Act, which bolstered our buddy Teddy Sherman Antitrust Act from way back in 1890. It redefined monopolistic practices and made peaceful picketing and striking legal. Wilson was also a champion of labor rights and introduced reforms that tried to recognize the importance of having time in the day where you weren't working or sleeping. He championed the 8-hour workday for federal employees and tried to empower workers, thus giving Americans more opportunity. Last but not least, for all my economists, he supported the establishment of the Federal Reserve, which still plays an important role today, regulating banking, keeping our economy stable, and managing the money supply and interest rates. Thus, the debilitatingly sickly Woodrow Wilson helped cement the legacy of the progressive era by entrenching reforms and law that have altered our society permanently.
In conclusion, the progressive era was an era full of amendments and developments that shape our society to this day. Thank you for watching this episode of Crash Course. I'm Brody Launer. Special thanks to this video's episode, Naomi Suzuki Lahav, our resident over-explainer Sullivan Turney, and our guys. We need to focus and actually get this project done, Abigail Pelletier de Chambre. Do 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 do. Cue end card. Bye.